everybody, this is a video I've been dreading for a while now, but here we are. Fallout 76. Originally released in November of 2018 for PC, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4, and I actually originally got this right around that time. Not very close after it. It was a couple of weeks later when it was on sale for dirt cheap, but by that point, it was still basically unplayable due to the horrendous performance, the ludicrous number of glitches, the server stability was absolutely atrocious, so I just set it aside and said, okay, I was just going to wait until the Wastelanders update came out, because it was painfully obvious that the game was released in a completely unfinished state for full price, which is incredibly obnoxious, and I was just not going to bother with it at that point. Well, fast forward almost 2 years, and here we are in April of 2020, and the Wastelanders update has finally come out, and the game's on Steam to boot. So how has that year and change of development and content expansions and constant patching and improvements actually affected the game? Well, let me put it this way. When I started the game up, it was still in borderless windowed mode for some utterly baffling reason, even though I hadn't run it in borderless windowed mode when I originally played the game. And it ran like absolute garbage. We're talking struggling to hit 35 frames per second most of the time. Now, some Bethesda fanboys might be trying to skew this as, oh, DW's computer sucks. Well, no it doesn't. I have an i7 4790K, 16 gigs of RAM, and a GTX 1080. And as you can see from the Afterburner overlay up in the top left of the footage, it wasn't even using half of my system resources most of the time. When I see that, I know that there's a problem with the way the game is coded, and I figured that I would look around and see if I could figure out what might have been causing it, and it turns out that it's because it was running in borderless windowed, which for whatever reason the engine just can't handle. I have no idea why, but it's that poorly programmed. So I put it into full screen mode, and you can see the results of the performance in this clip I'm showing you now, which was recorded in full screen as opposed to the previous one, which was recorded in the borderless windowed mode, and you can see that there was a clear improvement in performance. It still doesn't run especially well, and there's a frame rate cap of 72 for some utterly baffling reason, but at least that got it to a point where it was at least somewhat playable as far as performance goes. So I figured, okay, let's go ahead and continue on through the game, and eventually we'll be able to review this, right? Well, if you don't know the answer to that question by this point, then that means you haven't read the title of the video. But here's the thing, DW, I hear you saying, you have a series called games that infuriate me to no end, but that's not what the title of this video is. You would be right. Because you need to understand that there are varying degrees of bad or terrible games, or even games that are good but still manage to infuriate me, like, say, The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. A game doesn't necessarily have to be bad or terrible to infuriate me, but there's a very good chance that a bad or terrible game is going to be the one that's infuriating me anyway. Fallout 76 has managed to go so far into bad and terrible that it actually goes past being infuriating and just becomes outright depressing. Look, I thought I was prepared for Fallout 76 after having played Fallout 4. That game was absolutely terrible, but I managed to force myself through it, and I managed to get a very long, very critical review out, and I'm actually pretty proud of myself for being able to do that. After having been able to do that, I thought with Fallout 76 I would be able to do something similar, where I would just be able to steel myself and work my way through the game, and be able to actually do a full comprehensive review of it. But as it turns out, I was not prepared for Fallout 76. Oh, don't get me wrong. I was fully expecting this game to be absolutely terrible after having played through Fallout 4 and knowing that Bethesda is continuing their downward spiral that they've been doing ever since Oblivion. I knew the game was going to be a technical disaster because they were shoehorning multiplayer into an engine that was not designed for it. This is the Creation Engine. It is the same fucking engine that Morrowind used with a bunch of extra stuff bolted onto it ramshackle. As they've continued to expand its capabilities, it's gotten less and less stable, and throwing multiplayer and online infrastructure into the mix would be an absolute nightmare, and clearly that was the case, because on launch, the game was basically unplayable due to not only lag, but constant server disconnects. Eventually, they sorted that problem out, so it is at least playable now, if you can call the experience of going through this game actually playing. Because I certainly would not describe the experience of Fallout 76 as playing a video game. I'm not actually sure it's a video game at all. It might just be a bizarre psychological experiment that Bethesda has been conducting on its fanbase to see how much they can actually get away with. And the fact that Fallout 76 actually does have a fanbase means that they can clearly get away with quite a lot. Where do I even begin? I could start doing this like a review and start talking about the presentation, but there's not really much point in doing that. I've already talked about the presentation, because nearly every single graphical asset and animation and texture was just directly ripped from Fallout 4. In fact, it's such a blatant copy-paste job that when the community managed to get their hands on the game and start messing around with it and break it in interesting ways, they found a lot of stuff that was completely broken in Fallout 4 is still broken in Fallout 76, and they found that they could even spawn in things just from Fallout 4 because they literally just have all of those assets in the game. And considering that Fallout 4 was not a graphical powerhouse, and neither is this, it's absolutely baffling that the game's performance is as absolutely terrible as it is. Most of the time, even in full screen mode, I am not actually staying at a stable frame rate. It is regularly dropping well below 40 frames per second, and I have no idea why, because even in the instances where the frame rate absolutely tanks, it is still not using all of my system resources. And the funny thing about all of that is that even though they clearly just copy-pasted the engine over, and they copy-pasted nearly all of the assets over, and they even copy-pasted some assets from Skyrim, with the dragon rigging and AI pattern being what they used for the Scorch Beasts in this. They couldn't even get the copy-paste job right, because the game not only runs worse than Fallout 4, but it actually looks worse than Fallout 4. Something is just horribly broken with the way they've implemented the shaders, and it makes everything look absolutely terrible. You'll be able to see it at several points in the footage, but I can't really describe how it looks because it varies wildly from object to object. And by the same token, there are certain instances where everything seems to be working as planned as far as visuals go, and it doesn't look terrible, but it's certainly not impressive either. That's mostly when you're wandering around through the forests, for example. And of course it goes without saying that the physics glitch out constantly, that there's tons of pop-in that is incredibly annoying, the lighting's a mess, and the god rays are even more of a mess. The animations tend to glitch out on a pretty frequent basis. Sometimes things don't even render at all. For example, there was one instance where I was walking around in a cabin area, and I kept hearing an NPC talking and banging a hammer on something, and I looked everywhere for him, and he wasn't there. It was just the sound cues playing. And it might actually be kind of funny if it weren't so fucking pathetic. The sound at least mostly functions, although occasionally it'll glitch out a bit as well, but there's nothing to write home about there. It's all very basic sound effects, most of which are just ripped from Fallout 4, some of which are not, but they're nothing impressive either. It does have a fairly decent soundtrack, but the problem with that is, it's attached to Fallout 76. I mean, I know people like to bring up that cover of Take Me Home Country Roads that they used in the marketing material, and yeah, it's a good version of that song, and that's a good song to begin with, but funnily enough, when you actually get in-game, chances are you're not going to hear that as often as you might think, because while it does play on the in-game radio, it surprisingly doesn't come up that often. In fact, the entire time I was messing around with this thing, it only played on the in-game radio once. And that's still not going to change the fact that most of the music you're actually going to hear in the game is just a bunch of ambient stuff that frankly sounds more at home in a fantasy game than in a post-apocalyptic game like this, but whatever. So the presentation's a mess, we knew it was going to be a mess, we knew the engine was going to be a disaster, and that is exactly what it is even after heavy patching. So what about the game itself? Well, where do I even begin? The entire game is just such a jumbled mess that it's hard to figure out exactly where I should begin. Should I start with the story? Well, that's a hard question because there's actually 2 stories in this game now that the Wastelanders update is out. I guess I'll just start with what passed for the plot when the game originally released, which was that the game was set about 25 years after the Great War that annihilated civilization as we know it, and you are a member of Vault 76, which is a vault that is full of people who are meant to go out into the wasteland afterwards and rebuild. So you set out into the Appalachian wasteland and find out very quickly that every single human being in that area is either dead or has been turned into something called a Scorch, which is a zombie that is controlled by a hive mind that is ultimately linked to the Scorch Beasts, which are basically meant to be giant mutated bats that spread around the Scorched Plague, and which are meant to be the most dangerous enemies that you'll come across in-game. In practice, they're Skyrim dragons. They literally just reuse the animation rigging and the AI patterns from the dragons in Skyrim for this, so that's pretty much what everybody thinks of them as. And thus, the main story of Fallout 76, and its original guise anyway, is that you wander out into the wasteland, find it's like this, and thus you have to follow the Vault Overseer's journey as she looks into everything, which means that you're just going around various locations, finding the Overseer's stash, and getting her audio logs. Even to this day, you will still find a lot of audio logs throughout the course of the game, although previously it was the only interactions with any of the actual characters that you would be coming across, which means that you weren't actually interacting with them, you were just listening to something that they left behind before they promptly kicked the bucket. But anyway, I digress. After you find a few more of the Overseer's logs and get the basic controls of the game down, it gives you the main quest of the game, which is to inoculate yourself against the Scorch Plague, and find a way to defeat the Scorch Beasts and stop them from spreading the plague around once and for all. It's a fairly simple story, it's fairly straightforward. The problem is that when the game originally released, there were no NPCs to interact with outside of the handful of robots that you'll find around, so it made the entire world feel completely lifeless, bland, and uninteresting. Enter the Wastelanders update, which is set 1 year after the events of the main storyline of Fallout 76, where people have started to return to the Appalachian wasteland and have tried to eke out a living there. You have 2 main factions, those being Raiders and Settlers, although unlike in Fallout 3 and Fallout 4, where Raiders were always hostile, in this only some of the Raider groups are hostile. You can actually interact with certain groups of them and treat them as semi-friendly NPCs. At any rate, the Wastelanders update actually proves to be extremely problematic in the writing department, because you remember that whole thing I said about the Scorched Plague and the Scorch Beasts and how that's your main story of Fallout 76? Well, that didn't go away with the Wastelanders update. Even though the Wastelanders update is set a year later, there's still Scorched all over the place, there's still the Scorched Beasts you have to deal with, and you still can go through the entire storyline of the original version of the game. In fact, it pretty much expects you to have done that already, because one of the first things that happens with the new Wastelanders updates is you go and talk to the Overseer. You actually manage to meet her in person and talk to her about the goings-on in the Wasteland and where she's been and where we can go from here. And she goes, "By the way, did you get inoculated against the Scorch Plague?" And if you haven't progressed to that point in the original Fallout 76 storyline, you cannot continue the storyline of the Wastelanders update. Because that storyline involves inoculating both the Settlers and the Raiders against the Scorched Plague, and then tracking down a treasure hidden somewhere in the Appalachian wasteland that has been the reason that so many people have been coming back to the area. You see, the big problem with the writing in Fallout 76 is that it's obvious they didn't really put any effort into actually making it work in the context of the game they were building. This isn't necessarily a problem that's limited to Fallout 76. If you're playing any multiplayer-only game, it's going to have a problem when you introduce a storyline to it. Look at something like, say, Star Wars The Old Republic, where you have the main storyline of all of the different classes that you can play, but you also have expansion packs that came out in the years since the game released, and those expand upon things that happened in the main storyline, and you're still playing the same character and all that sort of thing. So how did they handle that? Well, You have to play through the main storyline of that character class first, then you can access the next expansion, and then the next one, and so on and so forth. If you wanted to skip ahead to the new content, then the way you would go about doing that is actually creating a brand new character, but it automatically gets leveled up to the level that's appropriate for that expansion. And at that point, it automatically assumes that all of the previous story content has been completed. And while that may be a very gamey way of doing things, that's pretty much what works in a multiplayer-only game. Fallout 76 doesn't do that. In Fallout 76, you step outside the vault for the first time like you would if you had just got the game on release, and you immediately get access to the new Arrivals quest, which is the start of the Wastelanders update. You see, Bethesda knew that the lack of human NPCs in the game was a pretty serious problem that people had with it, so they wanted you to gain access to that content as soon as possible. But the way they've written it doesn't make any sense unless you have completed at least a large chunk of the main storyline of the game, so it assumes you've already done that, but it gives you access to the new stuff immediately, which means that you're dealing with a time paradox. Good job, guys. You've completely fundamentally broken your own storyline in the span of a single update. I hope you're proud of yourselves. And you know what the worst part about this is? That's some of the least incompetent stuff that's on display in Fallout 76. And in fact, that level of fundamental incompetence is why I can't even stay mad at Fallout 76, and why it is ultimately so depressing. Honestly, I should be absolutely furious with this game for all of the shit it tries to pull. Like the Atom Shop, for example. It's their premium currency shop, where you do actually earn atoms in-game by completing challenges and such, but your main way of getting atoms is going to be actually straight up purchasing them. So here's the exchange rate. 500 atom points is about $5 US. So you can say about 100 atom points to $1. And when you look in the Atom Shop at all of the different items that are available, it's things like a Vault 76 cap, just like a basic baseball cap, for 500 atom points. Or the Vault Tech paint job for your power armor, which is just a blue and yellow paint job that doesn't even look very good, for 1,800 atom points. So $18 US gets you a paint job for your power armor. The only thing I can say there is, why? First off, why the hell would they charge so much for just a paint job, other than simply knowing they could get away with it? And more importantly, why would anyone in their right mind spend that much money on a simple blue and yellow paint job for your armor? It's downright absurd. I should be mad about things like that. I should be mad about the fact that they said at the beginning they weren't going to put anything gameplay affecting in the Atom Shop, and then barely a few weeks later they started throwing in gameplay affecting stuff into the Atom Shop as well, in the form of things like repair kits, which make things a lot easier for you. I should be positively furious that they continue to just stomp all over the desiccated corpse of what was left of the Fallout lore after the absolute disaster that was Fallout 4, with such things as yet more pre-war power armor in the form of the T-65 power armor, or the fact that the Brotherhood of Steel has an Appalachian chapter this early on in the timeline, when at this point in the timeline, they barely even had a West Coast chapter. And that's only some of the stuff they do to the Fallout lore in this. I should be furious about that kind of thing, but honestly, I can't bring myself to care at this point, because Bethesda proved with Fallout 3, and especially Fallout 4, that they do not give a single solitary shit about the established lore of Fallout, and only care about brand recognition. I should be positively livid that they threw a subscription service into a blatantly unfinished game in order to give you access to private servers where you can play with only your friends, as opposed to being limited to the public servers where you had to play with a bunch of randos all the time, as well as, much more importantly, the fact that the subscription includes unlimited junk storage, which is a pretty massive problem when you get into the game and you find out that you are constantly going to be over-encumbered by the fact that you are constantly picking up every piece of junk you can find in order to have scrap parts to rebuild all of your equipment, which you're going to be having to do constantly, as well as build various structures to have at your camp, at least assuming you've actually found the plans to build anything at your camp anyway. But I can't even bring myself to be mad about Fallout 76, because every single aspect of the game is just so utterly draining that by the time I finish it, the only thing I can think of doing is just staring into space. And while it's certainly going to be difficult explaining to you how a game somehow manages to do that, I'm gonna try anyway. So, understand this. The core gameplay loop of Fallout 76 is a jumbled mess that does not know what it wants to be. This is not really surprising if you're familiar with Fallout 4. That game is also a jumbled mess that doesn't know what it wants to be. Does it want to be a settlement management game? Does it want to be a first-person shooter? Does it want to be a role-playing game? Does it want to be a game that's all about crafting and survival? It doesn't know, so it tries all of those things and just fails miserably at all of them. Since at its core, Fallout 76 is just a copy-paste of Fallout 4, it inherits all of the same jumbled mess problems that that game had. These problems are compounded, however, by the fact that they made every single one of them worse. They have completely gutted the RPG mechanics down to the point where the only thing that really remains is the stat system. You still have the special system, but the way it works now is that whenever you level up, you get a point to apply to one of your special stats, and you get a selection of perk cards, which can be applied to your various special stats to give you a bunch of passive bonuses. These can be things like increased damage on certain weapon types by a certain percentage, or being able to craft certain upgrades for your equipment, or being able to pick certain levels of locks, or all sorts of things like that. The thing is, you don't really have any control over which perk cards will show up whenever you level up, or whenever you get a perk card pack to unlock, and you can only choose one perk card on each level up. And unlike in Fallout 4, where there wasn't a level cap, and if you really wanted to, you could unlock every single perk in the game, you are limited on which perk cards you can use at any given time in Fallout 76 by the values of your special stats. Each perk card has a value associated with it, with the upgraded versions of cards, which you get by having multiple cards of the same type and combining them into an upgraded card, will cost more points. So let's say you have a value of, say, 5 in strength, and you want to equip multiple perk cards to that particular attribute. Well, you can equip 5 separate 1-point perks, you can equip 1 2-point and 1 3-point, or 2 2-points and 1 1-point, so on and so forth. It takes a system that was already painfully dumbed down in Fallout 4 and turns it into something that is completely nonsensical and overly complicated despite also being incredibly dumbed down. And since you can't just select whatever perk card you want and have to actually unlock all the different perk cards, of which there's, I believe, well over 200 in the game, it turns the process of leveling up into an absolute chore. To make matters worse, while you do continue to earn perk card packs and such past level 50, at level 50 you stop earning points for your special stats. So what do you do if you hadn't statted things out exactly as you wanted them? Well, you have to wait for your next level up, upon which you can reallocate one of your special points. But what if you didn't want to reallocate one of your special points? Well, tough shit. And given how the game actually plays out, you're probably going to be throwing all of your special stat points into one or two of the stats, those mainly being strength just for the added carry weight, as well as intelligence for all of the different crafting things you can do with it. Now, the funny thing about this is that when I was originally playing Fallout 76 not long after it released, I was just throwing all my points into strength because I kept getting over-encumbered by all the random crap I had to carry around. And if I was at a point where I wasn't having any problems carrying stuff around, I would throw some points into intelligence in order to get the extra bonuses for crafting stuff. And then I ended up setting the game aside and waiting for the Wastelanders update. Well, the Wastelanders update comes around, and guess what? They decided to add dialogue options in the game. And given how absolute trash the dialogue was in Fallout 4, I was fully expecting your options to be a sarcastic way of saying yes, a way of saying yes, a way of saying no, but I'll look into it later, and then one way of asking a question. Well, as it turns out, they brought it back more to the Fallout 3 style, where you actually have a list of options available. And they even tried to put skill-based dialogue options back into the game. Except the problem with that is that there's no skills in this thing, so it's based entirely on your special stat value. And they're all absurdly high requirements. By absurdly high, I mean that most of the options I was seeing had a minimum value of 8 in that stat required to be able to use that dialogue option effectively. So in my particular character's case, I was about level 25 when I was attempting all of this Wastelanders stuff, which meant that the only values I had that even approached that were strength and intelligence. And yet most of the options there were for either charisma or perception, neither of which were particularly important up to this point. Especially not charisma, which until the Wastelanders update came out was basically only used to give your allies bonuses, which meant that you were having to constantly play with a team of other people. Literally every single other stat in the game was far more important than charisma. Then you get to the Wastelanders update and finally it serves a purpose. But that purpose is so singular that it may as well not exist. This isn't like Fallout 1, 2, or New Vegas, or even to a much lesser extent Fallout 3, where you have options for getting through things peacefully. Here, you are almost always expected to just run around and blast the living shit out of everything. So funnily enough, by them reintroducing an element that was seen as a major part of the series' identity up until Fallout New Vegas, because Fallout 4 completely threw a monkey wrench into the whole thing, they actually ended up breaking things even more than they had already broken them. And yet I've been seeing people praising this as if it's some sort of return to form. No, this is not a return to form. It's a half-assed attempt at throwing something into the game that people said they wanted, and yet Bethesda has no idea how to implement in this game. In fact, nearly every single problem that this game has is because Bethesda has no fucking idea what they're doing. And nowhere is that more abundantly clear than when you just start wandering around exploring things, fighting enemies, and trying to find stuff you can use. Because you'll start wandering around and it'll be fairly easy at first, because the starting area is basically what you would expect a starting area in any sort of online game to be. There's a lot of low-level enemies, a lot of low-level gear, and you can go through it without too much problem. But once you wander slightly away from the starting area, you find that very quickly things get completely out of control. So you start off in an area that is roughly for level 1 to 10. Pretty easy stuff, nothing you're going to really need to worry about. Then you start wandering slightly afield, and you find that you're starting to run into a bit tougher enemies that are a bit higher level than level 10. It's not that big of a deal, though, because you can still deal with those. And then you'll just keep wandering around, you'll still be fighting those enemies around that same level, and then all of a sudden you'll run into something that's level 50. Now sometimes you can see something in the distance and know that you probably shouldn't mess with it, like the Mirelurk Queens or the Scorch Beasts. Those are very large, you can see them from a long distance away, and if you keep your distance, you don't aggro them, it's not that big of a deal. But that's actually the exception to the norm. The norm is that you'll just be wandering around, plowing through enemies that are appropriate for your level or even way lower level than you, and then all of a sudden you'll run into something that's about 30 levels higher than you. And the especially weird thing about it is that there's actually a zone map that you can find on the internet that shows you the different zones of the game and what level range it's supposed to be. And it is completely inconsistent with what you'll actually find in the game. And what's even funnier is that some of the ranges themselves are downright insane, like the Mire, which goes from level 30 to 99 on that map. That is a downright absurd level range, but the thing is, I totally believe it, because I've wandered around in the Mire at level 25, and while I was able to handle some of the enemies in there, very quickly I was running into things that were level 50 and higher, and I had to leave immediately. Now, of course, if this were a single-player game where you could save anywhere you wanted to, then that wouldn't be as much of a problem, because you would wander into an area, find it's way too high level for you, and be like, oh, okay, I'll just not go there and come back later. Well, this isn't a single-player game. It's a multiplayer game. You can't save your game. So what ends up happening when you go into these areas and you find these enemies that are massively higher level than you that you can't possibly beat, if you can't get away from them, you just die. And what happens when you die in this game is you lose all of your junk items. You know, those things that you've been carrying around so you can actually repair all of your equipment or make any modifications to it or build things at your camp. All those junk items that when broken down contain the materials that you need and which are actually surprisingly hard to find at times, yeah, you lose all of those. So the game pushes you to explore and then promptly punishes you for doing so. Great design right there. It honestly wouldn't even be that hard for them to fix this problem. All they'd really have to do is put up some form of signpost and you'd be like, hey, you shouldn't go to this area until you're such and such level. But they either can't figure out that they need to do that, or they just can't be bothered. I can't tell which, and either way, it's pretty frickin' insulting. Of course, it certainly doesn't help matters that they couldn't really figure out what to do as far as the multiplayer component goes, and instead of trying to make everything work as a cooperative experience, they decided to just throw everything into the PvP side of things and be like, hey guys, you can launch nukes at each other, isn't that fun? Well, as it turns out, if you launch too many of them, it'll crash the server, so that's not fun at all. And even then, if you launch it at other players, then that's pretty obnoxious, and nobody does that anyway. They'll just launch it at a point on the map so they can get all the new legendary drops and everything from it. Because the blast zone will spawn a bunch of incredibly powerful enemies that you can go and farm for really powerful items and such, and that's really all people use it for. In fact, nobody even bothers with the PvP to begin with. There's really no reason to. There's no tangible benefit from it other than the fact that you might annoy someone. In the entire time I was messing around with this thing, I only engaged in PvP once, and it was by complete accident. I was wandering around and exploring, and then all of a sudden I get a message that pops up on screen and says, "You are wanted," and it gave me a 10-cap bounty, and I'm like, okay, what just happened? Apparently, I had opened a container in one of the areas that I wasn't supposed to open, but there was no indication that I wasn't supposed to open it. So the bounty gets applied to me, I'm left scratching my head, and I end up looking up what I can do to get rid of it. Turns out there's literally nothing you can do to get rid of it. The only way the bounties go away is if you die. So I wandered off to an area where there were other players, and somebody was very helpful and just went up to me and started blasting me with a shotgun until I died and respawned right at that same point and just went back to whatever it was I was doing. I'd already stored all the junk I was carrying, so it didn't even matter. I lost nothing for that. So the PvP is a complete bust, which is absolutely hilarious because the developers themselves outright admitted that they thought people would be engaging in that far more than they ended up doing so, and were utterly baffled when players decided not to do it. So not only did Bethesda not know what their fan base wanted in the first place, even though the fan base has been pretty clear about what they've wanted for quite a while now, they were also just completely incompetent at implementing a PvP system into their game. Of course, it's not like they made the cooperative elements any better. The only things you can do with other players are wander around and do the same exact thing you can do on your own, which is to say, go around and shoot stuff, or craft items, or wander around and explore. And that's it. Or you can take part in public events, which are basically just mini-quests that respawn from time to time. And in my experience, all of them were quite simply just defend this point for a certain amount of time. The game has a severe lack of variety, and you find out that once you've played the game for about maybe an hour, you've experienced everything there is to experience in Fallout 76, and the rest of your time with it is going to be going through the motions. All of the quests are the incredibly generic MMO style of just wander to certain location, wipe out whatever enemy is there, or find X number of items, or whatever the case may be, all of it being extremely simplistic, bland, boring, fetch quest bullshit that you're used to from any MMO you've ever played. And once you've finished a quest, it automatically deposits whatever the rewards were into your inventory, and so you might just be wandering around after having completed all the objectives on a quest, and suddenly you find that you're over-encumbered because whatever it gave you pushed you over the weight limit. Sure, the quests will have an XP reward as well, and you're going to be looking for those because leveling in this game is a mind-numbingly tedious chore that seems to take fucking forever. I mean, to give you an idea, by the time I just stopped playing, I had hit level 25, and for the past 5 levels or so, it was taking me multiple hours of grinding to go up a single level, so it was just not even worth it. It doesn't help that outside of the super generic MMO style quests and just wandering around picking up random crap that you find and shooting any enemy you come across, there's really nothing to do in the game. As I said, the PvP is just not worth bothering with, so you're going to be going around and doing all of the single player and co-op stuff, which means that the entire game is just going to be wandering around the wasteland collecting whatever random shit you find all over the place so you can grind it down for materials, or you might find some equipment that you might not even be able to use because it turns out that they decided to level gate every single piece of equipment, including the power armor in this. So even if you do somehow manage to beat one of those super high level enemies that you didn't think you'd possibly be able to beat, and it gives you some equipment, you're not going to be able to use it because it's way too high level for you. And by the time you do finally hit the level where you can actually use the item that you've found, you've probably found equipment that's actually better than whatever that item is. I mean, to give you a prime example, I was wandering around and exploring and I ended up finding a pistol that was marked for level 25, and I'm like, cool, I'll just save it for later. But then I compared it to the pistol I already had and had been using for the past 5 levels or so, and it was actually weaker in pretty much all of its stats than that. So I was like, well, what's the point of even having this in the first place? So even if you do explore and do find enemies that are way higher level than you and manage to beat them and take the gear that they drop, and that gear is considered high level for what you are right now, you're not going to be able to equip it, and more importantly, by the time you are able to equip it, you can't even enjoy it. Because by that point, you have inevitably found something better than it, and probably lower level than it as well. So you'll do what you do with most of the items in the game. You'll break it down for parts, and then use those to repair the stuff that you already have that you already like, or you'll use it to upgrade the stuff that you already have. And speaking of upgrades, they even made that a tedious grind fest, because when you go into it and start trying to modify your equipment, you find out very quickly that there's no options for you to modify it with. So you have to find the crafting recipe for it, and the way you do that is to break down other items of the same type. Which of course is fine if those items spawn frequently, but if they don't spawn frequently, then you're reticent to do that. Of course, you might be able to find plans for not just these modifications, but also various structures that you can build at your camp at the various vendors scattered around the map. But the problem with that is it uses caps as currency, which of course doesn't make any sense from a lore standpoint, but since Bethesda doesn't give a shit about the lore, why should I at this point? But anyway, the rate at which you earn caps in this has been dramatically lowered to the point where you're basically earning maybe only 1 to 5 of them at a time. Selling items at vendors always gets you a ludicrously low amount of caps back, so there's not really much point in selling items unless you literally just can't break them down, like the legendary items you can find, which you can only sell. For some baffling reason, you can't break those down. But anyway, the amount of caps that the various plans cost is always going to be well into the hundreds, sometimes into the thousands. So if you do decide to go the vendor route for finding the plans for the various things you can craft or build as part of your camp, you're gonna be grinding out caps for quite a while. Oh, and as if that weren't enough, if you decide to fast travel around the map to make things a bit easier on yourself, you find out very quickly that the only places you can fast travel for free are Vault 76, your camp, and if you happen to have a teammate, you can fast travel to them. But if you don't have anybody in your team, then you can't fast travel to them for free. If you decide to fast travel anywhere else, it costs an amount of caps. Usually not a large amount of caps, but enough to where, at least early on, it's going to be something you're going to be avoiding. Oh, and if you're thinking you might be clever and circumvent the cap cost by moving your camp around, guess what? Moving your camp costs caps too. And of course, you can't just place your camp anywhere. It has to be in the wilderness away from an established location, otherwise it'll just prevent you from deploying the camp, and you also have to deploy it in a location where it actually is okay with the terrain. Now of course the camp does come with its advantages. You can store a bunch of your crap there, whether it be the just random items that you're carrying around or especially all of your junk items, but here's the thing, if you don't have the Fallout First subscription, then the junk items take up space as well, and there's a fairly limited amount of space. It seems like a lot at first. You get a limit of 800, but then you find out pretty quickly that's actually not all that much space. Because you have to keep in mind that nearly every single item in the game takes up weight. And if you have certain items, like, say, ammunition, that can take up quite a lot of weight without you really realizing it. And if it's not ammunition that's taking up all of your storage space, it's going to be the junk, and especially your food and water items. Because Bethesda saw that survival games were getting popular around the time that they were working on this, and they decided to throw in survival elements in the form of a food and water meter. Which just means that occasionally you have to drink some things or eat some things just to fill up some meters so you don't suffer nasty penalties. And of course, eating pretty much anything in the game is going to give you some rads, so you're going to need some rad away for that just to be safe. And if you consume rad away, then that increases your thirst, so you need to drink some water with it. Oh, and it puts a debuff on you that makes you susceptible to disease for a while. And of course, rad away, food and drink items all take up precious inventory space, and if you have prepared food and prepared beverages, those degrade after a while, so eventually you end up with spoiled versions of the food, which has a very high chance of giving you disease and is mostly just used for crafting into some sort of fuel if you have the appropriate plans for it. Otherwise, it just sits in your inventory taking up space until you finally notice it and just get rid of it. I'm sure by now there's Fallout 76 fanboys taking to the comments saying how I'm full of shit on this, and if you don't like it, don't play it. And what about Fallout New Vegas? It had a hardcore mode that did the exact same thing. Why didn't you complain about that? Well, the reason I don't complain about it in Fallout New Vegas is because it's a completely optional thing in Fallout New Vegas. In Fallout 76, the entire game is built around grinding so you can grind some more. There is absolutely no depth to this game whatsoever. Every single element is purely designed to be annoying or tedious or both. You would think that those survival elements would be there to add challenge or something like that, but they don't. It is absurdly easy to find food and drink everywhere in this thing, and more importantly, you find way more rad away than you find even stim packs. So all those rads you're taking from eating the contaminated food and drink don't matter. You can just take the rad away, and within 15 minutes, the debuff that you get from that is gone. It's not that big of a deal. It is a bit more of a deal if you have the diluted form, because that will give you a 2-hour debuff instead of a 15-minute one for some baffling reason. But all the debuff does is increase the likelihood that you're going to get a disease, and you can get disease cures at a pretty frequent basis as well, so you don't even really need to worry about that. So the survival elements are completely pointless and were just shoehorned into the game because I guess Bethesda just saw that survival games were popular for a while, and they decided to just copy-paste that into their game because they thought it would make their game more popular. And speaking of things they put into the game because they thought it would make it more popular, there's a Battle Royale mode. Because of course there's a Battle Royale mode. Every fucking game these days has to have a Battle Royale mode in it. Because apparently you gotta chase them Fortnite dollars, whether it makes sense to do so or not. And given that the PvP system that's in the game is as unpopular as it is, and people didn't really want to play PvP in a Fallout game to begin with, I don't really see what the point of putting a Battle Royale mode in this particular game was anyway, other than the fact that Bethesda had their priorities completely off kilter. And it certainly doesn't help that even the combat is not any good in this thing. It's the same system from Fallout 4, but made worse by all the other crap that they've thrown into the game. And sure, the combat in Fallout 4 was a slight improvement over the combat in Fallout 3, and to a slightly lesser extent, Fallout New Vegas. That's not saying much. The combat in Fallout 3 especially was garbage. It was improved a bit in New Vegas, which is why there's less of a step up from that. But here's the thing, Obsidian knew what they were doing when they made Fallout New Vegas. They made it a role-playing game first, and the combat system was a secondary element. You can get through that entire game without killing anybody if you really want to. It's not easy, but you can do it. That is not the case with Fallout 3, 4, or especially Fallout 76. Fallout 76 is a shitty first-person shooter with slight RPG elements tacked on to it. And those have been so thoroughly gutted that they may as well not even exist. So what is the first-person shooter combat like? Well, it's a tedious slog. Every single enemy you come across is just a bullet sponge. They are incredibly stupid. There is no challenge to the combat whatsoever. It's just a matter of can you put out enough damage to drop the thing before it puts out enough damage to drop you. And half the time the AI is too stupid to actually be able to take you out anyway, so it becomes a completely trivialized mess until you run into those enemies that are high enough level that they just do a ton of damage to you that you can't do anything about. And even in those fights, sometimes the AI actually glitches out and puts itself into a position where it basically can't do anything, and so you can just sit there and whittle it down until eventually it finally drops. And while they obviously couldn't implement the VATS system from Fallout 3, New Vegas, and 4 without it completely breaking everything that Fallout 76 is trying to do, because Fallout 76 is a multiplayer game, ultimately they ended up making the VATS system completely pointless. It doesn't slow down time anymore, obviously, because again, that would break the entire game. So what it does instead is become a basic target lock-on system that only allows you to shoot at the torso. Never mind that the primary reason you would use the VATS system in the first place is to be able to get called shots on various limbs so you can cripple those limbs and thus make the enemy a lot less capable in whatever that particular limb controlled. Nope, just gotta reduce it down to a basic target lock-on system that still uses your action points, which is also used for sprinting and for jumping. Oh sure, it'll gradually build up a critical meter that allows you to get the next shot off as a critical hit, but frankly I never found it all that useful. And to make matters worse, if you want to be able to target limbs like you could in previous Fallout games, you have to actually get perk card upgrades to be able to do so. So in other words, to make a mechanic viable in this thing, you have to sacrifice other mechanics that are considerably more important. Yeah, no thanks. In fact, no thanks is just what I would say to this game in general. It is such an absolute disaster of a game that, frankly, I don't think anybody should play it. I don't care if you like the game or not. You should not be playing it. You should not be supporting their obnoxious microtransactions, their obnoxious subscription service, and their complete incompetence at development. And ultimately, it's the combination of all of that that makes this game so depressing. The entire game is built around grinding so you can grind some more, and the consequence for failing at the game is having to play more Fallout 76 so you can get back to where you were. It alternates wildly between being incredibly irritating and incredibly boring, and it does it so much that you just don't know how to feel about it. It's basically emotional whiplash. And that's ultimately why I end up just kind of staring into space after finishing a session of Fallout 76. I just sit there trying to process what I just went through. Am I mad at it? Am I just sad to see what this has turned into? I don't know. It's a combination of both, and I just kind of mentally shut down when trying to process it. It's just such a mind-bogglingly terrible game that seems to get worse every single time they update it. I mean, with the Wastelanders update, they introduced a glitch that causes people to lose the equipped items they were carrying if they manage to die from an NPC. Because as it turns out, the NPC will loot the corpse of the fallen player and take their stuff and equip it for themselves. Because, like with most of the things they've done with this game, they just copy-pasted the NPC system over from Fallout 4 and didn't really pay any attention to the way it actually worked, and thus you end up with a situation like this. And that's just the most recent bit of developmental incompetence, lest we forget the fact that a while ago they released a patch that was supposed to fix issues, but it actually ended up breaking a bunch of things that had already been fixed in previous patches. And like I said before, I can't even really be mad at Bethesda at this point. It's just so pathetic, it's downright depressing to watch. And with all of this crap going on, what would even be the point of me finishing this for review? What point would a review of this game serve at this point? Everybody knows it's garbage. The only people still playing it are the die-hard Bethesda fans who refuse to believe that Bethesda can do any wrong, or the ones that are mistakenly holding on to the pathetic hope that Bethesda will somehow get its shit together. Look, they haven't had their shit together for a long time, and they clearly are not going to get it together anytime soon. Certainly not with Fallout 76. The best thing they can do for Fallout 76 at this point is put it out of its misery. I'd say they could try to hold on to the shred of dignity they still have and just pull the game from sale and shut down the servers, but they don't even have a shred of dignity left anymore. They have made that abundantly clear over the course of Fallout 76's development and release. But perhaps the most depressing thing about this entire debacle is the fact that Bethesda still has a fan base. It still has a selection of people who seem to think that Bethesda can do no wrong. It still has a group of people that will continue to defend every pitifully bad excuse of a decision that Bethesda makes. They still have a group of people who will continue to buy every single Bethesda game that ever gets released, regardless of how unfinished, broken, and unplayable of a disaster it actually is. There is still that selection of people who will buy into those completely overpriced and frankly absolutely pathetic microtransactions, and there is still that group of people who will pay for the subscription service that monetizes the living crap out of things that other games do for free in a game that already costs $60 US on release. And why is that so depressing, I hear you ask? Well, it's quite simple. Bethesda looks at that fanbase, sees that they can get away with all of the shit they've gotten away with thus far, and they know that they can just continue to do the exact same thing and continue to make money. I have been saying this for years at this point, but Bethesda has been on a serious decline ever since Morrowind. Morrowind was the last good game that Bethesda Game Studios ever made, and ever since then, their games have gotten worse and worse and worse until you finally hit Fallout 76. And the saddest part about this entire mess is that the decline of Bethesda was allowed to hit this point in the first place. Bethesda should have been checked by their fan base a long time ago, when the signs were already starting to show, when we knew that the creation engine was a janky, completely broken mess. They should have been told, no, this is not acceptable. You need to replace this with an engine that is actually good. They should have been told that, hey, you can't just release these broken, unfinished games and then foist the responsibility for finishing them onto the modding community. They should have been told that the continuing removal of depth in their games is not acceptable and that they need to focus on making truly deep and engaging experiences like they did back in the Morrowind and before days. But despite the warning signs being obvious, and despite numerous people, including myself, saying for many years now that Bethesda games have been in very steep decline, this was still allowed to happen. And until the Bethesda fanbase finally wakes up to the fact that they need to vote with their wallets and not allow Bethesda to continue to get away with this crap, it's just going to keep happening. So those of you out there who are looking forward to Elder Scrolls 6 and Starfield, know that this is what you're going to get. You're just going to get this level of ineptitude again unless you put your foot down and say, enough is enough, Bethesda. You need to sit down, take your time, and do it right. Thank you all very much for watching and sticking with me during this long and rambly rant of a video. I'm going to need one hell of a palate cleanser after Fallout 76, because this game was legitimately depressing to play. You may think I was being hyperbolic, you may think I was exaggerating or just making fun, but I was not. I would stop playing Fallout 76 and just stare at my screen for a while because I just could not process how I felt about it. I've never played a game that was this kind of bad before. I've played plenty of terrible games over the years, I've played plenty of boring games over the years, but Fallout 76 is a truly unique pit of despair. I actually legitimately had way more fun playing Ride to Hell Retribution than I had playing Fallout 76. I had no fun at all playing Fallout 76, because even the glitches were just annoying, they weren't funny. At least a game like Ride to Hell Retribution is so bad it's hilarious. That's not even the case with 76. It's just terrible, and I could find absolutely no redeeming qualities about it whatsoever. So I cannot reiterate this enough. Do not play Fallout 76. There are so many other games out there that are far more worth your time than this pile of garbage. Do not play it, and do not let Bethesda get away with this shit anymore. Thank you all again for watching, and thank you all again for bearing with me during all of this, and I'll see you all in later videos.